By beginning today, I'd like to introduce Dan Dornberg, who will be our moderator. Dan is the president of Fairness.com, an online clearinghouse for fairness-related info and links. He created the Silicon Valley's computer literacy bookshops, the world's largest chain of computer bookstores, until its sale to fatbrain.com. So without further ado, thank you all for coming, and I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Before I introduce the speakers, I was asked to pass on two minor logistical ground rules. Everyone who has cell phones should turn them off, please, lest they drown out our distinguished authors. And we're going to be taking, hopefully, a lot of questions from the audience. And if you have questions as we get to that part of the panel, the session, we have a microphone set up over here to my right. And if you could please come up to speak clearly, because anyone asking questions as well as the authors will be televised on C-SPAN. So everyone has their 15 seconds of fame at least. I'll introduce the panelists. To my left is Jeremy Campbell, author of The Liar's Tale, A History of Falsehood. And he's also the author of Grammatical Man. He's the Washington correspondent for the Evening Standard, an English newspaper. He's a graduate of Oxford University, and he lives in Washington, D.C. And despite the accent, I'm told that he is now a U.S. citizen. Okay. So we should welcome him. Also an American citizen is Chuck Lewis. He's a MacArthur Fellow and author of the book The Cheating of America, as well as 3 or 4 other books. And he is the executive director of the Center for Public Integrity, which he founded after a career as an investigative producer for 60 Minutes and an investigative reporter for ABC and CBS News. Bill Press was supposed to be here with us, and at the last minute he had to cancel. So his apologies, my apologies. He's with us in spirit. His book is with us in the flesh, but otherwise we have to carry on without him. So to get things started, my first question is an impossible one for Jeremy Campbell. His book, A Liar's Tale, basically covers 2,000 years of Western ideas, intellectual history of truth and falsehood and deception and issues like that. And just as a background for all of us, he's going to give us a 5 to 6 minute summary of those 2,000 years.
Well, I start by saying that originally I decided to write a book about truth, a history of truth. And in the course of my research and cogitating and reading, it occurred to me that there isn't really much of a history of truth, because truth is truth, and you know, then you come to the end and the end of the discussion. But it seemed to me that falsehood does have a history, and a rather interesting history, and it has, I think, its periods in which it's taken seriously, and periods when it's not taken so seriously. And I pick out just a handful of periods of history when falsehood was looked at not as something bad and wrong and you shouldn't do it and all that sort of thing, but was looked at in a rather sophisticated, open-minded sort of way. The first of these periods was in Greek civilization. I actually start with Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus is a very cunning and scheming and dissembling character. He tells a few lies in his journeys, but that is regarded by Homer in a sort of ethical way, ethical in the archaic sense of being strong and surviving. And it's because the society the environment that he moves in is very dissembling, is dishonest and cheating in an ingenious way. And his only way of dealing with that is to cheat back. And Homer seems to approve of that in a way. And then in the Greek Enlightenment period, in the 5th century BC, you had the sophists, who it was a society that was changing from the old nobility to a much younger urban crowd, very ambitious, very interested in politics and the law. And so being able to speak in a persuasive way, to argue both sides of the question, to shelve truth in favor of persuasion, was regarded as a very desirable thing, and something that you would pay quite a lot of money to a sophistic teacher to tell you how to do. And then I move on to the medieval period, when something called nominalism came into fashion, which nominalism was, it's very complicated, but I advise you to read the book, of course. But one of its arguments is that ideas to which medieval philosophers had attached an enormous amount of importance to as containing the truth, were in fact just words. And words can be manipulated and juggled with, and they're slippery, and that was another main point that I make in the book is the question of whether philosophy really does have any bearing on ordinary life. And I think that's a double-edged thing, in that I think people now have decided that philosophy, as the search for truth, really doesn't have much of a bearing on their day-to-day life. And on the other hand, philosophers, I think, have got bored with writing about truth and not interested in it anymore. They're much more interested in language as a material object. And so, you know, you have these two things going on in tandem that I think encourage the idea that truth is not as important as we used to think it was. And there's more I can say, but I think I've used my time.
Does those issues at sort of an abstract level, those are pretty much the same issues that you deal with in the trenches of investigative reporting, correct?
Well, it's true. We don't. We usually look at what they do, not what they say. In general, I run a nonprofit group, the Center for Public Integrity, and we've done 100+ reports, and we've looked at all kinds of things in the private sector and government, both. And yes, people are duplicitous, and yes, there are cover-ups, and yeah, there are common themes here. But it's actually gotten so thick in terms of lying that I find it much more useful to watch the actions, not the words, because I think I would get bogged down very quickly. So, anyway.
Americans grow up hearing stories about Honest Abe Lincoln and George Washington, who could never tell a lie. But how much truth do we really expect from our business and political leaders, both at a personal level, their integrity outside of government, and to what extent is lying a necessary tool of government? You check?
Well, lying is probably necessary in wartime, at least occasionally. Most people, or not most people, a good number of people think that. I don't like to say that too often because it could encourage people to do that. But I think that we have complained about our politicians for the duration of this country. If you read history, we always felt that members of Congress were scoundrels, and we always complained about all these people and their truthfulness. It's actually, this has been going on for a long, long time, our general level of frustration. In the modern era, with the Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War, there was a disillusionment that set in this country, a cynicism, whatever you want to call it, about our officials. And we may have just seen another chapter just in the last several months. You know, the Enron scandal is a very, very interesting situation where now we're seeing words like Enron-itis, which refers to the level of truthfulness by companies in their annual reports and other documents. We generally do expect, on some level, our politicians to tell the truth, and we're not at all surprised when they don't. And as investors, we expect information to be accurate and truthful when we invest, for example, but we're increasingly coming to the view that that's not happening, and annual reports are works of fiction with footnotes that are generally unreadable. So there is something going on here that's really quite fascinating. The thing that is really fascinating to me is right now, this very minute, roughly 85% of the American people support the president in general, and 67% think that he has not told the truth about Enron. And there's a compartmentalization about the truthfulness thing about Enron, but it is subsumed underneath the whole wartime economy and all the other larger issues. So we've come to accept and tolerate obfuscation as a way of life in the political realm. At least it feels that way to me.
Okay. I'm told some of the people in the back can't hear us, so I'm going to pass this on to a talking stick, I suppose, a more sophisticated one. From a historical perspective, from your research, does the attitudes that Chuck was just talking about, how does that compare to other periods and other cultures from your research?
Well, I think there's a theme that runs through the book, which says there may be a larger good than the personal good. And if the protection and survival of that larger good can be kept in business by lying, then that's a good thing. I think in the medieval times, when the individual was seen not as an individual, but simply as a little unit in a huge organization, which was the medieval church, truth-telling, which is preeminently, I think, a personal virtue, tended to be edged out by public virtues, which was the flourishing and survival of the church. Interestingly, Hans Kung tells a story of when he was at the Second Vatican Council, and he was talking to an American cardinal, and an American bishop walked by, and the cardinal said, he is an absolutely honest man. He would only lie for the good of the church. That's a very medieval sentiment. And I think these are extremely abstract. I sit in my room at home and I think thoughts. You know, Chuck lives in the real world, but these are the abstract ideas that occur to me. That the sort of society we have now, where the moral authority of the state derives in large part from the existence of social justice, and not just the existence of social justice, but the expansion of social justice. And I think, in that sense, public virtues edge out private virtues. And expanding social justice, I think, in some cases, calls for a double standard. Men harassing women are punished more severely than women harassing men, and there are many other examples of that. And a double standard is a sort of lie, but it's a lie. It's something benevolent that we think is necessary for the extension of social justice. So a theme in my book is, going back to Socrates, is that there may be something more important than truth.
Wow. Maybe you have another question.
More important than truth, that's a you follow-up for you.
Okay.
Well, actually, as long as we're joking around, I might as well go with that one a little bit. In our culture, contemporary America, truth maybe is not so highly valued as wealth or fame, or, I mean, how important is truth to us, the man on the street, just gross generalizations these days, do you think?
Well, read my book. But there's a whole movement, apart from the ones I've mentioned, called modernism, which was in large part an artistic and literary movement. And I think it was sort of crystallized in that movement, the modernist idea that the world is becoming more and more artificial. That the Greeks had two terms, physis and nomos. Physis was nature, what was given by God. Nomos was what human beings created. And it seemed to be in the modernist period, physis more or less disappeared and nomos completely took over. And society, everything became extremely artificial. And I think then, of course, then the Greeks thought there was a natural correspondence between the mind and physis. So you arrived at truth in an entirely natural way. But I think in the modernist period, which I think is an extremely interesting period, lasted end of the 19th century to about 1920. I think people's attitude towards the simple truth, and again, this is a question of, does philosophy, does art, does literature, does painting, do the ideas generated by those things in our culture affect the ordinary person's attitude to life? And I think to a certain extent they do. And in the modernist period, the emphasis on the artificiality of everything, it seems to me, militated against the idea of truth, and sincerity, and genuineness, and naturalness, and all the rest of it. Seems to me.
Chuck, we're gonna...
Wow.
You get all the easy ones.
Yeah. Jeez. It's hard for me. I am a little too close to the real world, I think. These are wonderful things. I'm going to have to read this for sure. You know, what I'm fascinated by are the 100 million Americans who don't vote today. And I do believe a good number of them don't believe the politicians and don't believe what they hear from Washington or from various folks in society. And I do think there is a disconnect and a sense of alienation that's not just based on education or class, but also the truthfulness of what people hear and think, the authentic qualities of what is in society today. And I do think there's a sense of increased artificiality on all fronts. You know, one of the things that has always interested me, I know this is not a specific thing in either of our books, but the public relations industry and how it's grown over the last half century. And I remember, I know that Bill Press's book has the title in it, Spin, but I remember when we used to call that lying, and and now it's spin, and it's admired, and it's actually taught on college campuses as a really neat thing you should know how to do. And I've had college interns come to the center. We've had 125 paid interns since we started 12 years ago, and one of them was in a spin class, learning how to do damage control. And one of the class exercises was, you have a toxic waste dump, you work for the client, we have a problem here, how are you going to explain it? And of course, truth was not really part of the conversation there. And that's where we are as a culture. And it's not, you know, we can beat ourselves up. It's actually not just an American problem. I suspect this is a global problem. It relates to communications and public relations and lots of other issues that are pretty deep and elaborate. But I'm fascinated by what it means for governance and democracy, and how do you try to build support and trust of a disparate people in a difficult time when you may not have the trust, or at least it has waned. And we've seen a resurgence of trust since 9/11 in terms of government officials like firefighters and policemen and even our president. And that's wonderful, and it's important, I think. So we're in a little bit of an unusual moment right now because of that incident, and I don't know how long that'll continue, and that's another conversation. But before that happened and since, you're still going to have these other problems of alienation and low voter turnout and all these other things. And so there's something there about truth and lying. And no one likes to use the L word in Washington, of course. So you never accuse anyone of lying. You've been less than forthright, or you know, maybe you have obfuscated. I mean, we have all these euphemisms. No one wants to actually call them liars. That's a little bit outside the norm of protocol of conversation. So part of the fun of this is the ridiculous minuet that occurs around the language of lying, which I also enjoy. But it's also why I've avoided it altogether, and I just read government documents and I track what these guys do. So anyway,
Let me follow up on what one of your comments here. I'm going to read, when you referred to Bill Press's book, I'm going to read you just a very short paragraph from the book, because language is very important in his book and also in Jeremy's book. And so I'll read this paragraph, and then you can both respond in terms of issues of language. This is Bill Press talking about spin. There is no good definition of spin. It's easier to say what it's not than what it is. It's not the truth, neither is it a lie. Spin lies somewhere in between, almost telling the truth, but not quite, bending the truth to make things look as good or as bad as possible, painting things in the best possible or worst possible light. How does a philosopher respond to that?
Well, I was quite interested during the Clinton administration to notice an absolutely classic example of postmodern approach to language on the part of Clinton's press secretary, whose name I've forgotten, I'm afraid. When something went wrong, the phrase that was used initially was, "mistakes were made." But that gradually, or rather suddenly actually, became "mistakes came in." And I have a chapter in my book called "Language Made Me Do It," which is about a movement called post-structuralism, which is a rather silly and difficult set of ideas. But one of the ideas is that we don't use language. Language uses us. Language speaks us in their slightly ridiculous phraseology. And that's another example of the point I made. Does philosophy, and however crazy, I mean, philosophy is crazy by definition, does it filter down into the real world that Chuck occupies and I don't? You know, is it important in that sense, or is it completely irrelevant? That's something I really haven't decided.
Can you give us some examples of language, and as well as your general, just real things that really stick in your mind?
maybe one will come to me, but I was going to mention, back to the Clinton example, that fascinated me so much was, in the first year of the Clinton presidency, a pollster, Stanley Greenberg, was paid $2 million by the Democratic Party to do polling, and this pollster was in the White House with the president once a week at least. And I'm not saying the Democrats are the only ones who use pollsters. Both parties use pollsters, and so in the instance of parsing out truth, or in small doses, there is testing of words. Which word, which message and which precise word will best convey what we want to convey. It doesn't mean it's truthful, of course. That has nothing, that's never even brought up in the conversation. So you have a group, a professional group, that their job is to find the best, most soothing, the best words possible to be used in a speech context. And then, of course, and it's particularly relevant with Clinton, you also had the lawyers and there were quite a number of them. And their job was to very, very precisely use the exact correct word for fear of prosecution later. And so how any truth came out is a miracle to me. When you've got all these people whose job is essentially to filter it, filter reality. And there are in Washington alone thousands of people, literally on Capitol Hill, at the Pentagon, in the White House, paid for taxpayer money, whose job it is to frame it in a very nice, important, useful, and don't we feel good about ourselves way for the American people. And getting beneath it, and one of the problems for journalists, I think, which gets back to the real world, is how do you separate what they say from what they do? Part of the problem with the explosion of the media and all these cable channels and 24/7 discussion, even though there's no news, but you keep talking, is that no one is there to actually go look at the records and check what they're saying, and did they say the truth there? Well, I'm not sure, but now we're listening to this, and we're in such a freeze-dried existence now in the information age. Things are moving so quickly that the role of the media, just as one example of folks whose job it is to watch what they say and do, is a little bit different than it used to be. The media is, I would argue, not doing it, at least it feels to me frequently, is not always doing as good a job as it ought to do in tracking what is real and what's not real. And the other problem is we all have a short attention span. So if you do find out a week from now that the president or the Senate Majority Leader or someone completely lied through their teeth, you're on to the next story and the next crisis and the next issue, and that story will probably be on page 19. And so this idea of tracking the truth, and that is difficult. And no matter who you are, no matter what you say today, it will be challenged because we live in a very polarized politically and ideologically. We live in a very push and pull kind of world here, so anything anyone says is suspect. And you know, I was once thinking of writing a book about lying and truth, and I was going to call it The End of Truth, because I'm not sure we ever know what truth is anymore, and it worries me, actually.
Okay. Let me, following up, you mentioned about the media and the information age, and I was wondering if you could both comment as journalists and print journalists and television journalists. How good a job is the media doing these days, particularly the news, but in general, in trying to broadcast truth? That's part of its public service mission and its charter. How good a job is it doing, and how has that changed over the past 10, 15, 20 years?
Coming from England, the thing that most struck me about American newspapers is that there are so few of them. And I think outside the major cities, you tend to find rather bland, quite fierce reporting about local issues, but nationally rather homogenized, agency-originated copy, which I think is a waste of resources, newspaper resources. In England, I think maybe there are too many newspapers chasing too few stories, but at least that makes them more aggressive and adventurous in trying to get, at a deeper layer of a story. Whereas here, I think what the New York Times says is more or less accepted as scripture, and the Washington Post. And I was absolutely flabbergasted is maybe too strong a word. But when Dan Rather went on Bill O'Reilly's show several months ago, and Bill O'Reilly told Dan Rather that he ought to be ashamed of himself, that his show was flabby, lacked edge, didn't use the reportorial resources. Dan sort of collapsed and accepted all this. And, you know, next evening you watched his show and it was the investigative hard news Dan ran. Maybe there are some celebrity journalists who are too close to their sources. I don't know.
Boy, this is a topic that you could write books about, I guess. I think that the media generally could be much, much more investigative. Most newspapers don't want to spend the money to investigate. It takes time. A lot of even the large newspapers have a quota system. You're expected to churn out X number of stories a year. If you're a producer for a news magazine at the national level, at a network level, you are supposed to do X number of pieces a year. That means that you're going to do a profile of Muhammad Ali or Lily Tomlin. You're not going to investigate Enron before it becomes a scandal. You're just simply not going to venture out and take the time to do that. It's going to cost time, it's going to cost money, and if it doesn't turn out to be a good story, you're fired. It's a very, very weird atmosphere right now, and you know, there's a study at Harvard that there are literally hundreds of journalists, I'm not making this up, in therapy because of what has happened to the journalism profession. I'm actually not kidding. The working journalist has a very difficult time doing their job, and you continue to have consolidation issues where you're going to replace a show like Nightline with a comedian, and that is accepted practice, and that's something that no one is apologizing for, in case you haven't noticed. You know, that's the culture. And so, yes, we can talk about the media, and I'm happy to do it. And if you want to go to our website, publicintegrity.org, we investigated the media, a study called Off the Record about their own commercial and legislative interests of the media corporations. If you want to look at things that are not covered, you'll never read that anywhere in the media, but it's kind of interesting. But the other problem, just very quickly, is the government. We have seen a tectonic shift in the information available to us. When you're at war and there's no pictures of the war, and the only news that's being given is from a podium at the Pentagon, that's not coincidental. We did a report after the Persian Gulf War called Under Fire, 110,000 word, 10 researcher effort over a year, looking at the history of information from the Pentagon about wars. And the sea change, just in a couple sentences, the sea change was Vietnam, because you had body bags and dead bodies in living rooms in every American home, and people saw the horror of war, and attitudes changed against the war. So at the Naval War Colleges and the Army colleges and everything, inside the military establishment, there was discussion, how do we deal with this? This is unacceptable. We can't let cameras anywhere near the battlefield ever again. The example they started to love was the British Falkland Island experience, where all their journalists were put on a ship about 10 miles from any action, and they couldn't see anything, right, and literally ever during the war. Then we had Grenada, where no reporters were allowed on the island for several days until they were brought in to see how everyone was grateful and kissing the earth. And then in Panama, same thing. Journalists were allowed to watch CNN coverage in a little room somewhere, but they weren't allowed to actually see what was happening in the streets. And of course, the Persian Gulf War was video games writ large with briefings from Saudi Arabia and the Pentagon. And even body bags arriving at Dover Air Force Base was a national security threat, and they were not even allowed to show body bags at Dover Air Force Base, which is ridiculous, to me at least. So you have a combination of commercial and other pressures on the media from doing what it ought to do, and to make matters worse, you have the normal self-serving pressures of government officials trying to cover their hindquarters, and it's a very deadly combination when it comes to truth.
Just a footnote to Chuck's remark about the frustration of British journalists covering the Falkland Islands War. A book on the war came out a few months after it ended. The reporter for my paper, the Evening Standard, was Max Hastings, a very distinguished war correspondent. And in the index to this book, it said, Max Hastings attempted murder of. So I turned to the page, And Max wasn't being, it wasn't an Argentine that tried to murder him, it was the reporter from the Daily Mirror, because they were cooped up on this, on this ship, you know, trying to get stories under very, very trying circumstances. So that's very true.
Okay. I'm going to switch gears in just a minute and get some quick reactions from the authors about some current events and historical events, just quick takes, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions. But I did have to ask Chuck a question because April 15th is coming up, and that's the subject of his book, The Cheating of America, is about tax policy and tax cheaters. And I'm not referring to anyone in this room, but I was wondering if you could just make a few general comments about American tax policies and some of the issues you just explore in the book.
Thanks. Will Rogers said that the two things that'll make the biggest liar out of you, one is golf and the other is taxes. And, you know, this is a really fascinating subject to which I encountered a whole literature. The fall of all the major civilizations going back thousands of years are, some say, related to the taxes and how there was resistance to paying them over time with certain ancient civilizations.
Richard II.
So we didn't get into that too deeply in our book, but the fact of the matter is that every year $200 billion of taxes that ought to be paid are not paid in this country. And so we wanted to go find out who's not paying their taxes. There are literally thousands and thousands of millionaires in this country who don't pay any or hardly any taxes. Thousands of corporations that don't pay any taxes. There are expatriate billionaires who try to move to places like the Bahamas where there are no taxes but still live in the U.S. And there's all kinds of things. And so we wanted to see the extent of this. We literally went through U.S. tax court records for 3 years with a dozen researchers, and then I had the fun job of actually confronting some of these people. So I went to Belize, and there was one fellow who was indicted for tax evasion who had fled the country and had been wanted by Interpol for 15 years, and he has a resort with his third wife in the jungle there, and I checked myself in and talked to him for 4 or 5 days, and he was living very well in a beautiful estate with an orange tile roof, 25 servants making $6 a day, gourmet cooks, satellite dishes, I mean, just living like a king. And he said, I won. And he said, you know, he basically had put all of his assets offshore, which brings me to a really interesting question that a thing we discovered. With globalization, that loaded word that means 100 different things, there are 3 million corporations offshore, $3 trillion in assets offshore. No one has any idea who owns them. Not just the U.S., other countries don't know. The United Nations doesn't know. And so nation states are increasingly having trouble with cyberspace banks and offshore jurisdictions keeping track of money in general. So tax collection is becoming a problem. And we encountered wealthy millionaires and billionaires who, one of them said, well, I treat whatever the IRS says as merely a recommendation whenever I hear what I'm supposed to be paying, and it's really the first offer in a negotiation. And they hire law firms. I'm not making this up. Law firms whose job it is to wear down the feds. And there's one law firm in Chicago, and they'll work at it for 10 or 15 years, and what will happen is they'll initially assess someone, say you owe $50 million, and when it's all said and done, they'll settle for 3 cents on the dollar. And it was worth it. You know, financially, it worked out for them. We talked about the makers of Terminator 2 and Rambo, who socked $100 million offshore in Hong Kong and didn't pay any taxes. And I tried to knock on their door in Bel Air, but they had a gate. But anyway, so this book is about who are these people, why are they doing it? And then the last thing, policy-wise, is really interesting is we're all worried about tax cuts. That would be $2 trillion we would have if we actually collected our taxes properly. But in the last 10 years, we have reduced the staff of enforcement at the IRS by 30%. At the same time, the number of people that are paying taxes has risen by 15%. So you do the math. So the people that are audited most often in this country are those who have incomes under $25,000. And IRS officials said to us, why do you think we go after the little guys? They can't fight back, quote unquote. And so we have a system here, and everything I've just said, to me at least, still feels quite compelling and amazing. But no one in Washington wants to talk about it. Neither party, neither end of Pennsylvania Avenue. There's no move afoot to change the way we enforce tax laws. And that's the dirty little secret about tax policy.
Okay. Let me get your very quick reactions to maybe 5 or 6 events, questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Again, what I said earlier, if you have questions, you can come up to this microphone here, and that'll be in just a minute or so. Each of you were in Washington at the time of Watergate, and I wonder if you just quickly comment on the significance of that event, what attitudes were like before Watergate, during Watergate, and after now.
Well, I think Watergate happened at it was almost simultaneous with the 60s protest peace movements, and I think it just was the crowning event that made that generation completely skeptical about politics and politicians.
I agree. I had a fairly weird experience. I worked for a senator during Watergate, and then I worked for Carl Bernstein a few years later after Watergate. There's no question, I completely agree, the country lost its innocence. We saw the extent of lying, and it played out over 2.5 years and 400 or 500 stories, drip by drip, Chinese water torture. We got the truth, finally. It took a while to find out what it was. But I think it was a sea change in American politics. And most people put the end of the 60s, not at 1970, January 1st, but when Nixon resigned. Many people see the 60s were from the Kennedy assassination to the Nixon resignation as sort of a very, very interesting time where we lost our innocence, really, as a country. And I don't think we've ever gotten it back in terms of trusting our authorities. Honestly, I don't know when we've all changed and suddenly become trusting. I can't think of that moment. Maybe for a week in September.
A rather snobbish English editor once said to me, America has lost its innocence many, many times. But it doesn't realize that a loss of innocence is not equal to maturity.
Let me see, I'll start with Chuck, but I'll get both of your reactions. Center for Public Integrity, Chuck's organization, was the first to really detail just how extensive the connections were between Enron and Governor Bush, now President Bush. And can each of you comment on just what you see the significance of Enron, both its political influence and also its demise as a company?
Well, it is the biggest financial scandal in U.S. history, in that it's the biggest bankruptcy in U.S. history. The last time we had an energy company this deeply involved in a political scandal was the Teapot Dome scandal. And it is the president's #1 campaign contributor in his career, and his father was very close to Enron as well. Father and son together received approximately $6 to $8 million from Enron over a 13 or 14 year period. That's not to say the Clinton administration did not do favors for Enron, because they also did. This is a bipartisan thing, although if you track the money closely, the $6 million hard and soft money Enron gave since '89 to parties and politicians at the federal level, 74% went to Republicans, the rest to Democrats. But it is a bipartisan scandal, but it is a great case study of the intersection of commerce and politics in the form of one company. And this one, unlike the campaign finance scandals of '97, this one is understandable, and you also have thousands of victims. You have thousands of people who have lost their jobs and their pensions, and you have lost literally $50+ billion in equity disappeared in less than 6 months. And that means investors all over America have also been hit by the scandals. This is not a complicated scandal. Those 3,000 offshore partnerships are complicated, but the dimensions of the deception and the enormity of it are not complicated. And the last issue, since we're talking about truth and all that, it's been the first reaction of the Bush administration when this thing burst on the scene as a major scandal in mid-January is really fascinating. You might recall that in a matter of hours, Kenny Boy became Mr. Lay. And, you know, there was a very, very clear case of not wanting to acknowledge the closeness or the relationship. And the correct answer probably, if you're going to think in a strategic way, not a truthful way, the story about his mother-in-law losing $8,000, that should have been what they did the first day, not the 2 weeks later. There was a free fall where the president and Ari Fleischer and the other White House officials would say, well, no one was contacted at the White House. And then the next day, the Commerce Secretary Evans would say, well, I talked to Andy Card at the White House. And we're like, hey, you could just see them burying their head inside the White House. They could not get their story straight. And for this president, it was the first time since he burst on the scene in March of '99 that they actually had a crisis in terms of damage control and dealing with the media. They had never had a moment when they didn't have a good answer and they hadn't planned the whole thing very carefully. This was suddenly happening every night on the news for several weeks, and that's why you have those high poll numbers about distrust. So it's a great case study also about how a White House handles an inconvenient situation, and it gets directly to the subject of the panel, actually.
Yes, one of the lessons of Watergate was it's much worse to cover up something than to put it all out immediately. To tell, I mean, the Johnson administration used to deluge reporters with so much information that they couldn't sort it out. But I think that's something, a difference between American and British politics, that in Britain, if something goes very badly wrong, or if a senior government person has got himself in trouble, they tend to cut the umbilical very quickly and try and put it behind them as quickly as possible. Here, I think there's a kind of macho tendency to want to stick it out. You know, survival. If you can stretch it out for a certain length of time, then you might, you know, get a brilliant lawyer, or something else might come up to take people's attention away from this. And I think also, you know, one of the big mistakes in this line has been made by the Roman Catholic Church, which has allowed this thing to fester, and instead of making a clean breast of it as soon as possible.
Just one more, and then we'll switch over to audience questions. The tension between personal privacy and the need or the value of telling the truth to the public if you're a public servant. In the case of Bill Clinton and that woman Monica something, and also George Bush and President Bush, whether or not he may have used drugs, or Bill Clinton, whether he may have used drugs and early in his life. What do you see are the truth-telling obligations that bear upon someone? How much truth do they need to tell if they're a public servant?
Well, it seems to me that there's a residual inclination among the American public to let private things be private, although they make up their own minds about the character of the person involved. And I think politicians, Gary Condit maybe could be included in this, exploit that tendency in public opinion to say it's none of your business. I was elected to do this job, and I'm going to do this job for the American people. And I think if they say that aggressively and strongly enough, that trend in public opinion will, although they're damaged, will enable them to survive.
Wow, this is a hard one. I'm still literally trying to decide what I think about this. American journalistic attitudes have shifted over many decades. I would say before the 70s, American journalists did not write about the private lives, and we can go through that, but most Americans never saw a picture of FDR in a wheelchair. Most Americans didn't know about what John F. Kennedy was up to until Judith Exner's name came up in the 70s during congressional hearings, and they started seeing the ties to certain mafia figures, and suddenly the private life became more accessible in terms of, and more interesting, and frankly more relevant in some ways. And so my sort of general rule of thumb especially is if it affects their conduct in office, or it involves if it involves not only their conduct, but if it becomes it affects the public attitudes and around that person. For example, in the case of Condit, it became a police matter very quickly because she was a missing person, and one of the last people she saw was Condit. By the way, at the center, we don't do sex scandals, so I generally try to stay out of these personal things. The Lewinsky matter, you could have an endless debate. Should it have been investigated? Was Clinton placed in an untenable position that many presidents could have been placed in and weren't, and so are his lies defensible? But the fact of the matter is, it happened, and he was impeached, the first elected president in U.S. history to be impeached, and we could debate that one till the cows come home. And I have a hard time with the personal life question, and with Bush not answering. What's happened is, there has been a slight increase in the amount of privacy since the late 80s around presidential candidates. There are some instances where it has begun to be off limits, and journalists have begun to step back, or at least they showed signs of stepping back. The journalists were not the ones who pursued the Monica matter initially. It was the investigation as it unfolded, and the media jumped all over it. But when I'm pointing at it, it was not a media revelation. The media covered what was being given to them. They were manipulated, basically. And they're always manipulated on every story, by the way. So this is a very hard question. There are no rules about it. That's why I try to just read government documents. I don't have to deal with these weighty issues of personal life stuff. We don't do that stuff at the center, and one of the reasons I hated the things I hated in the media was once in a while a sex scandal would come along, and we would be obliged to go do a stakeout at somebody's house, and that stuff drives me up the wall. And I do have a problem with, I have a thing about their privacy, and I don't think reporters should go through people's trash, and I think there are certain things that are reasonable and fair. But I also know that their character is relevant as we choose the most powerful person in the world to go in the White House. And we've written the Buying of the President books. We don't talk about the personal life because what they have done officially is pretty interesting. But anyway, I'll never have a good answer to that because I'm still trying to figure it out myself. And I actually think as a nation we're trying to figure that out. There's no clarity on that right now.
Thank you. Are there questions from the audience? People are waiting here to have a chance. Okay, and please ask your question as short as possible and as clear so everyone can hear.
All right. Is it on? Okay. Jeremy Campbell earlier spoke of the value in the medieval period of placing the church over the truth on behalf of the public good. From my standpoint, spin is basically staying on message for the public good. And the criticism of the media from this presidential administration has been because they don't support the public good. So my question is, how responsible do you believe the media has been in demonstrating what they're doing is for the public good?
Good question from some people in the back. I didn't hear.
Yes, the question really is, how far has the media been successful in showing that some things the Bush administration does is not for the public good. Am I right? Have I got it right? Well, I mean, different people define the public good in different ways. That's the problem. We haven't got a monolithic organization like the Catholic Church or the Communist state. So I think the public good is very, very difficult to define. And the Bush administration defines it in one way, and other people might define it in a different way. And therefore, those people would think that something that was not quite true that the Bush administration said in the pursuit of its goals is wrong, whereas other people might say it's right.
Yeah, this is one of those eye of the beholder questions. The Bush administration would say that there's maybe a little too much focus on Enron, a little too much focus on that energy task force, and not enough focus on the war coverage or the war effort. I think on the narrow specific issue of the war effort, I can't imagine how they could be unhappy with the coverage. For the most part, everything that an administration would want to be conveyed has been conveyed, and it is even more extensive than that. For the first time in the history of the television networks, a president's advisors approached all three networks and asked them not to air videotape from one part of the world because it may not be helpful to the war effort. And for the first time in half a century of network television programming, they all agreed. In 1979, during the Iran hostage crisis, Jimmy Carter, as president, asked 60 Minutes not to do an interview with the Ayatollah Khomeini. And 60 Minutes thought about it and felt that the world had a right to know who this guy was. And Mike Wallace went there and interviewed him. And call me crazy, I think that's useful for the public good to know that. And I can't say one thing wrong with what happened to the national security when he did it. And so this is a constant balancing act. And the media is supposed to be, on some level, a watchdog for the public good, but that does not mean a lapdog. And I can point to things where I can see occasional lapdog stuff, to be honest with you, but I haven't seen too much in the way of excesses by the media. Maybe I'm missing something.
We have gone, can you hear me? Just talk loud. We seem to have gone from Jefferson's Greek revival to the fall of Rome, complete with barbarians both within and without the gates. What is the point of a democracy if there are no truths to vote your conscience with?
Thank you. Did everyone hear the question?
No. Okay, maybe repeat the question.
Would you like to restate that question?
Yeah. We seem to have gone from Jeffersonian Greek revival to the fall of Rome with barbarians both within and without the gates. What is the point of living in a democracy if there is no truth to vote your conscience with?
And that may explain why 100 million Americans don't vote. At least many of them don't vote. That's what I was alluding to that earlier. There are a number of people in this country that are worried about what they hear and they don't accept or believe what they hear. And how do you have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people if almost half the people don't believe what they hear? That could be a problem in a democracy. And no one addresses that. This question is not a question you normally hear, or you don't hear a dialogue about this in general in Washington. You don't hear anyone in Washington even being upset that 100 million Americans don't participate in this democracy. It's a non-issue. So I think it's a very serious problem, and it's one that I think about almost every day. I can't tell you I figured out what the answer is. So we'll keep muddling along into the 21st century with an imperfect version of democracy and the oldest democracy, and maybe it isn't a democracy, but whatever it is, we'll keep doing it, I guess.
Well, something that really bowled me over the other day was to read that Gorbachev told a gathering somewhere that a communist doctrine had been pure propaganda, which shows that he doesn't know and maybe never did believe in the communist doctrine, which I thought was pretty staggering, and maybe we could say some of the democratic doctrine is pure propaganda, and really have a clearing out of the some of the hypocritical and not very workable aspects of our democratic thinking.
I was wondering what effect, if any, you gentlemen see in the recent passage of the campaign finance reform on our disaffected voters. Do you think this will get more people voting if we think our vote is not bought? And maybe would this then also influence the tax collection of people saying, I'm tired of paying my little piddly bit from $25,000?
That's a good question. Yeah, will the new campaign finance reform change the way people feel about government and also the way they feel about paying taxes? I think something along those lines. We should have a full transcript here later. No, I'm just kidding. I think, I actually, in the conclusion of the Chief of America, relate the campaign finance issue to the tax collection issue. The fact that 96% of the American people don't give a penny to any politician. A check of $1,000 comes from 1/3 of 1%. So our political process is basically paid for by the most powerful interests that want something from government. I mean, that is a reality, and about 95% of this country believes that policy is affected by money. Shows you the level of cynicism. The bill that passed the other day in the Senate, which reformers have tried very diligently for 7 years to even get to this point, and it's the first time in more than a quarter century since Watergate that any bill has passed both houses and will be signed by the president. It's historic in that it's the first bill, but it's also not a panacea. I mean, you basically had $3 billion in the election process at the federal level in 2000, $3 billion. Soft money, which we have now outlawed, is 1/6 of the total. So you have $2.5 billion that's still coming from the wealthiest folks in the country to our federal politicians. You also have some other forces at play, independent expenditures. You have a lot of actors now in our process that are not candidates and they're not officials. They just want to influence the process. The so-called issue ads. In '96, there was $150 million spent by outside groups on both sides, Democratic and Republican-leaning groups. $150 million. In '98, it was $300. In 2000, it was $500 million. Those are going to keep going up. And the states. We are at the center, being the masochists that we are, going through records in a way that's not normal. We knew that this would probably pass, so 2 years ago we started looking at the states, the back door of American politics, and there are 400 party committees that have taken in $500 million through the back door, and no one has ever added up the money and told you where it came from, and we're going to put all that out with a searchable database on our website in June, and you're going to be shocked when you see who's been giving money and how much they've given. You're going to fall off your chairs. And a lot of activity will now move to the states. I'm not trying to give anyone indigestion, but we haven't. They made an important step, I think, trying to reduce the role of money. And I think John McCain and Russ Feingold and the folks involved in this mean well. I do think they were trying to do a good thing here, but we should not come to the conclusion that this problem is solved, because the money is still there, and we still have a process like the one we have. It's been modified a bit, and these guys are very diligent and enterprising, and as McCain said, they're probably downtown now working on ways to get around the new laws. So unfortunately, this is an ongoing struggle. The history of reform in the U.S. is that it occurs outside Washington. Women's suffrage, civil rights, all those issues always came from outside in, and there's always a tug of war on both sides, and it goes on literally for decades. And I hate to tell you, this is a long, this isn't going to be resolved today or tomorrow or this week or next week. It's just an ongoing struggle, a drama really, about our democracy itself and who owns the country and cares about the country.
Well, it's always struck me how much more upset Europeans get about the anomalies in American society than Americans do. I mean, the Europeans can't sleep at night thinking about capital punishment here and money in politics and the vulgarity of some aspects of popular culture. And I was wondering, it just occurred to me, you know, maybe it has something to do with the size of the country. You have these small, say a country like England, which is very small, and the government has a tight grip over legislation. Party discipline is very strict. And here I think it seems to me people feel that they're just one person in all these hundreds of millions of people and spread over this vast continent, and all this these gigantic sums of money sloshing about, and very well organized things like the NRA. At the time of Princess Diana's funeral, people would say, "Oh, England's lost its, it's gone soft in the head," and whereas when the Elian Gonzalez story was running here, people would say, "Oh, it's just those crazy Cubans down in Miami." It's not. They don't make general statements about the whole country, but those are just random thoughts.
We've got about 10 minutes left, and then the author is going to be available for a book signing and just to chat. So we'll keep the questions as short as possible and answers as short as possible, and try and get everyone's questions before we end.
Okay. Is this working? Doesn't have the file. Okay. I recently contacted the Center for Science in the Public Interest regarding a large corporation's recent change in policy regarding a food product, a very popular food product, and the ingredient with which they're using to cook that product, because it went from bad to worse. And I explained all of this in simple details to this organization, Center for Science in the Public Interest. I also explained that this corporation is about to become a lot larger in a few weeks through a merger and a quote merger and so forth, and that very few people know about this. Their response was, "We covered that story 10 years ago." Now, it's still a valid issue. It has to do with cholesterol and heart disease, human health. Yet, that was their response. So should I pursue it with this organization and go to the chief of the Center for Science in the Public Interest? Or what is my option? Where else can I take this? Is your group interested in something like that, or what?
We might be. Publicintegrity.org. We might be. I mean, I know Mike Jacobson, the guy who runs this group you're describing. They've done important work about food and what's in our food. I don't know why they told you what they told you, and it's hard to deal in the specifics without knowing more about it. And the question is, if they did it 10 years ago, was it covered properly in the media? Much of what they do is covered well in the media, but maybe this one wasn't or something. Yeah. There's always, a lot of news stories seem to be old stories with new wrinkles, I find, and it's very possible there's a new development in this that the media should know about and that group should know about. I would urge that you go to the top of that group first, because they're acknowledged experts in the subject of what's in our food, and they're actually scientists. And we're very good at consuming food at the Center for Public Integrity, but we're not very good at telling you what's in it. So anyway, good luck. It sounds interesting, but I think you should keep pursuing them at least one more step.
Okay, anything?
Thanks.
Do you believe that since the American public are so used to politicians being less than forthright, it has made us as a society more cynical and pessimistic? And how do you believe that affects us as a society?
You've got that down.
Yes, and no. Yes, I mean, I was saying that earlier. I think that we have become a bit jaded and cynical, and we've come to expect falsehoods, I think, almost as a way of life. You have singers like Sting comparing politicians to game show hosts, which may be unfair to game show hosts, but I'm just kidding. I think it makes it difficult in terms of governance, again, because a good part of the country doesn't participate in elections at all, but also those who do don't do it with enthusiasm. It's hard to get excited about a leader or a movement or a party these days. We're so suspicious about everything. We don't know if we can believe anything, and it does have a way of paralyzing one in terms of civic action and civic involvement. The problem is we need to all get involved, and it's our process. I often say that we know more about our toasters than we do our politicians, even though we get burned by both. And, you know, it's very important. We know how many calories something has, but we don't know how our member of Congress voted. 2/3 of the American people can't tell you who their member of Congress is. 40% don't know the name of the U.S. vice president. More people know who is on People's Court than who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. You know, and when we have that kind of ignorance in this country and lack of engagement, we're going to get what we deserve on some level. And I hate to say it, but that's the public has got to step up here a bit, and it's hard to cut through the lies. I understand that. So you have to find places and people, organizations and individuals that you do trust and work from there. And there is a way to proceed here. It's not all bleak, but it requires energy and time and thought. And, you know, most people are very, very busy and they just don't do it. And that's what worries me the most, I think.
But Oscar Wilde once said the trouble with socialism is that it takes up too many evenings. And I think that, as with everything Oscar Wilde said, there's a grain of truth in that. But I think that there was a piece in the New York Times Magazine recently saying that a lot of Americans get their political opinions from Saturday Night Live and shows of that ilk. And I think that entertainment has acquired such a high value in our time that anything that is not entertaining is more or less put to one side. I think a lot of Americans are bored and have a short attention span. I'm an American, so I can say that. But I don't know what you do about it.
Got time for maybe one more question.
Is Matt Drudge a journalist, or what's really the impact of the internet on the issues you're talking about here with all the disparate voices out there now?
Well, I find Matt Drudge extremely useful. His website is pretty hard-working at spotting important news stories that have just surfaced, and he himself sometimes is a pretty good investigative journalist. I think he's a little bit more careful now than he used to be, and I find that I don't listen to the other internet voices, but I mean I think he is a very important figure in making news accessible to the ordinary person who uses the internet.
I think his links to articles are helpful as a service that way. I'm slightly less enthusiastic about what kind of a service he's provided. I mostly take issue with the factual accuracy of many. I mean, there were issues. He might be better now. I haven't checked lately, but one of the issues about the internet is that you have a blizzard of information, and some of it is just plain outrageously wrong and offensive, and there are some demagogic qualities to some of the Drudge material, and also he's a partisan, really, I think. It's okay to be a partisan, but you should say up there on the front that you're a partisan. And so I don't mean to trash the guy. I think he means well, and he has a great fedora. But the internet, on the other hand, is exceedingly wonderful. We have a network of 81 investigative journalists in 45 countries, and we use encryption technology, and we investigate issues all over the world, moving documents all over the world with the internet. And we couldn't do any of those things without it. And so we're going to put that money about all the backdoor of American politics I mentioned, 1 million documents on the web for everyone to see in June. Again, you couldn't do that without the technology. And so I'll take the rumor and the innuendo and the characters that have come along the way with it, because the benefit to information about our country is so wonderful. You can sit at your house and learn about your politicians now. I remember the old days when you had to go down to the Federal Election Commission and actually go through the records yourself, which of course most Americans can't do. So that's progress.
I've got a final question for the panelists to end things, and then again afterwards, everyone should exit through the rear door, and that's where the book signings and opportunity to chat with the authors will be. Jeremy Campbell's book starts out with a little chapter on sociobiology, and it says that our drive to deceive and to tell lies is perhaps somewhat genetically based. So with that as a prelude, how good can we possibly get in terms of truthfulness and avoiding some of the stuff we've been talking about?
Well, I think we have to try a little harder. I do know, animals, my first two chapters are about animal and plant deception, because the publisher insisted on a second chapter. But I mean, it is quite surprising. I mean, fireflies emit more deceitful. They signal their sexual activity is by signaling with flashes, and they emit more false flashes than genuine ones. And birds emit more deceptive calls than genuine ones. I mean, it's one reason that animal behavior is so complex, because an animal will deceive, and then the competitor will have to deal with that deception, so a more ingenious deception. And that's an aspect of evolution that I think is very interesting. We are very different from animals, of course. But I don't know that we are any more in love with truth than they are. And in fact, T.H. Huxley said that self-restraint is one of the great mysteries of human nature. The fact that we and then you have someone like Conrad, who writes novels about lying being a form of self-restraint. So you have this, very, very complex thing of human beings don't have simple. They don't think in simple ways, and they don't behave in simple ways, and they're not literal-minded people. And so I think lying and truth have their own supporters, each have their own supporters.
Last word, Chuck?
Wow. I'm not an expert on biology at all, but I know that there are base instincts like greed and vanity, and when you combine them with ambition and competition and the fact that we are all complex, there's inevitable bad things are going to happen, at least in some cases. And it is a complicated question, and that's why we have this problem. And I don't know how we're going to change it exactly, but I'm not trying to encourage any biologists out there listening that there's a genetic solution necessarily. Let's not go there. So anyway, I'm not very much helpful, and this is a cosmic question. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone who would like to chat with the authors or would have a book signed, again, exit through that back door, and they'll be along in just a second.
I advise you to read the book, of course, but one of its arguments is that ideas to which medieval philosophers had attached an enormous amount of importance to as containing the truth, were in fact just words. And words can be manipulated and juggled with, and they're slippery, and that was Another main point that I make in the book is the question of whether philosophy really does have any bearing on ordinary life. And I think that that's a double-edged thing in that I think people now have decided that philosophy as the search for truth really doesn't have much of a bearing on their day-to-day life. And on the other hand, philosophers, I think, have got bored with writing about truth and not interested in it anymore. They're much more interested in language as a material object. And so, you know, you have these two things going on in tandem that I think encourage the idea that truth is not as important as we used to think it was. And there's more I can say, but I think I've used my time.
Does those issues at sort of an abstract level, those are pretty much the same issues that you deal with in the trenches of investigative reporting, correct?
Well, it's true. We don't. We usually look at what they do, not what they say. In general, I run a nonprofit group, the Center for Public Integrity, and we've done 100+ reports, and we've looked at all kinds of things in the private sector and government, both. And yes, people are duplicitous, and yes, there are cover-ups, and yeah, there are common themes here. But it's actually gotten so thick in terms of lying that I find it much more useful to watch the actions, not the words, because I think I would get bogged down very quickly. So, anyway.
Americans grow up hearing stories about Honest Abe Lincoln and George Washington who could never tell a lie. But how much truth do we really expect from our business and political leaders, both at a personal level, their integrity outside of government, and to what extent is lying a necessary tool of government? Can you check?
Well, lying is probably necessary in wartime, at least occasionally. Most people, or not most people, a good number of people think that. I don't like to say that.
It occurred to me that there isn't really much of a history of truth, because truth is truth, and you know, then you come to the end and the end of the discussion. But it seemed to me that falsehood does have a history, and a rather interesting history, and it has, I think, its periods in which it's taken seriously, and periods when it's not taken so seriously. And I pick out just a handful of periods of history when falsehood was looked at not as something bad and wrong and you shouldn't do it and all that sort of thing, but was looked at in a rather sophisticated, open-minded sort of way. The first of these periods was in Greek civilization. I actually start with Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus is a very cunning and scheming and dissembling character. He tells a few lies in his journeys, but that is regarded by Homer in a sort of ethical way, ethical in the archaic sense of being strong and surviving, and it's because the society, the environment that he moves in, is very dissembling, is dishonest and cheating in an ingenious way. And his only way of dealing with that is to cheat back. And Homer seems to approve of that in a way. And then in the Greek Enlightenment period, in the 5th century BC, you had the Sophists, who were it was a society that was changing from the old nobility to a much younger urban crowd, very ambitious, very interested in politics and the law. And so being able to speak in a persuasive way, to argue both sides of the question, to shelve truth in favor of persuasion, was regarded as a very desirable thing, and something that you would pay quite a lot of money to a sophisticated teacher to tell you how to do. And then I move on to the medieval period when something called nominalism came into fashion, which nominalism was, it's very complicated, but truth-telling, which is preeminently, I think, a personal virtue, tended to be edged out by public virtues, which was the flourishing and survival of the church. Interestingly, Hans Kung tells a story of when he was at the Second Vatican Council and he was talking to an American cardinal, and an American bishop walked by, and the cardinal said, he is an absolutely honest man. He would only lie for the good of the church. That's a very medieval sentiment. And I think these are extremely abstract. I sit in my room at home and I think thoughts. You know, Chuck lives in the real world, but these are the abstract ideas that occur to me. That the sort of society we have now, where the moral authority of the state derives in large part from the existence of social justice, and not just the existence of social justice, but the expansion of social justice. And I think, in that sense, public virtues edge out private virtues. And expanding social justice, I think, in some cases, calls for a double standard. Men harassing women are punished more severely than women harassing men, and there are many other examples of that. And a double standard is a sort of lie, but it's a lie. It's something benevolent that we think is necessary for the extension of social justice. So a theme in my book is, going back to Socrates, is that there may be something more important than truth.
Wow. Maybe you have another question.
More important than truth. That's a you follow up for you.
Okay.
Actually, as long as we're joking around, I might as well go with that one a little bit. In our culture, contemporary America, truth maybe is not so highly valued as wealth or fame, or, I mean, how important is truth to us, the man on the street, just gross generalizations these days, do you think?
Well, read my book. But there's a whole movement, apart from the ones I've mentioned, called modernism, which was in large part an artistic and literary movement. And I think it was sort of crystallized in that movement.
That too often, because it could encourage people to do that. But I think that we have complained about our politicians for the duration of this country. If you read history, we always felt that members of Congress were scoundrels, and we always complained about all these people and their truthfulness. It's actually, this has been going on for a long, long time, our general level of frustration. In the modern era, with the Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War, there was a disillusionment that set in this country, a cynicism, whatever you want to call it, about our officials. And we may have just seen another chapter just in the last several months. The Enron scandal is a very, very interesting situation where now we're seeing words like Enron-itis, which refers to the level of truthfulness by companies in their annual reports and other documents. We generally do expect on some level, our politicians to tell the truth, and we're not at all surprised when they don't. And as investors, we expect information to be accurate and truthful when we invest, for example, but we're increasingly coming to the view that that's not happening, and annual reports are works of fiction with footnotes that are generally unreadable. So there is something going on here that's really quite fascinating. The thing that is really fascinating to me is right now, this very minute, roughly 85% of the American people support the president in general, and 67% think that he has not told the truth about Enron. And there's a compartmentalization about the truthfulness thing about Enron, but it is subsumed underneath the whole wartime economy and all the other larger issues. So we've come to accept and tolerate obfuscation as a way of life in the political realm. At least it feels that way to me.
Okay. I'm told some of the people in the back can't hear us, so I'm going to pass this on to a talking stick, I suppose, a more sophisticated one. From a historical perspective, from your research, does the attitudes that that Chuck was just talking about, how does that compare to other periods and other cultures from your research?
Well, I think there's a theme that runs through the book, which says there may be a larger good than the personal good, and if the protection and survival of that larger good can be kept in business by lying, then that's a good thing. I think in the medieval times, when the individual was seen not as an individual, but simply as a little unit in a huge organization, which was the medieval church,
by beginning today, I'd like to introduce Dan Dornberg, who will be our moderator. Dan is the president of fairness.com, an online clearinghouse for fairness-related info and links. He created the Silicon Valley's Computer Literacy Bookshops, the world's largest chain of computer bookstores, until its sale to fatbrain.com. So without further ado, thank you all for coming, and I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Before I introduce the speakers, I was asked to pass on two minor logistical ground rules. Everyone who has cell phones should turn them off, please, lest they drown out our distinguished authors. And we're going to be taking, hopefully, a lot of questions from the audience. And if you have questions as we get to that part of the panel, the session, we have a microphone set up over here to my right. And if you could please come up to speak clearly, because anyone asking questions as well as the authors will be televised on C-SPAN. So everyone has their 15 seconds of fame at least. I'll introduce the panelists. To my left is Jeremy Campbell, author of The Liar's Tale, A History of Falsehood. And he's also the author of Grammatical Man. He's the Washington correspondent for the Evening Standard, an English newspaper. He's a graduate of Oxford University, and he lives in Washington, D.C. And despite the accent, I'm told that he is now a U.S. citizen. Okay. So we should welcome him. Also an American citizen is Chuck Lewis. He's a MacArthur Fellow and author of the book The Cheating of America, as well as 3 or 4 other books. And he is the executive director of the Center for Public Integrity, which he founded after a career as an investigative producer for 60 Minutes and an investigative reporter for ABC and CBS News. Bill Press was supposed to be here with us, and at the last minute he had to cancel. So his apologies, my apologies. He's with us in spirit. His book is with us in the flesh, but otherwise we have to carry on without him. So to get things started, my first question is an impossible one for Jeremy Campbell. His book, A Liar's Tale, basically covers 2,000 years of Western ideas, intellectual history of truth and falsehood and deception and issues like that. And just as a background for all of us, he's going to give us a 5 to 6 minute summary of those 2,000 years.
Well, I start by saying that originally I decided to write a book about truth, a history of truth. And in the course of my research and cogitating and reading, it occurred